Hello, everybody. Today we are here with TJ D'Agostino, assistant professor of Notre Dame International, where he's teaching international education. And also he directs initiative on faith-based schools, more specifically on Catholic schools globally. He and we have been collaborating together. We have wrote a couple of articles. We have been presenting some things, and we have been talking a lot about education around the world and the place of faith-based schools. And this is our third quiet conversation, in the sense this is a spot where we talk about education the same way we do in bars, or with the idea to share the state of educational pluralism in the world. Thank you for being with us today, TJ.
Great to be here.
So, TJ, I know a lot about you. We've been talking a lot, but can you just tell us briefly about your work so people get to know you better?
Yeah, sure. So it kind of got started in the field of, I was a teacher. So when I graduated from the University of Notre Dame, I became a teacher in a program that Notre Dame sponsors called the Alliance for Catholic Education. I taught high school English and theology for 2 years. And then I came back to work for the organization and got involved at that time in working with Catholic schools in Haiti. And this was a small part of my job. I was also working within the organization domestically in the US more broadly, where we work with supporting teachers and kind of outreach services and research for Catholic education in the United States. But the work in Haiti really took off after the earthquake in 2010. And I became very involved in co-leading a project that supported kind of improving the Catholic school system, especially focused on improving quality of teachers and teaching and learning, especially in early grade literacy. So we worked in partnership with the Catholic Church. They run 2,300 schools in Haiti. And we were both supporting programs and also studying the effectiveness of those programs. That work went really well, and it led me to go get a doctorate in education policy and leadership and join the faculty here at Notre Dame in 2018. And the work in Haiti has kind of been influential on my work since then. So there's two major interests that I have. One is kind of improving education systems in low-income countries. I do a lot of work in Africa and a bit in Latin America. And that can be just general broad policy efforts, and especially related to kind of improving teaching and learning and foundational skills development of children in low-income contexts. And then the other part of the work I'm super interested in is the role of faith-based and Catholic schools internationally. So do a lot of work in Latin America right now, especially, but some work in Africa. I've done some research there. And that's related to some of what I think we're going to talk about today, which is part of that is kind of how the work of faith-based schools intersects with public policy and what the legal landscape is like in different contexts and how it affects their access to funding, whether they're publicly funded or not, the kind of regulations that govern what how the schools can operate, which has been super interesting. So I know we've talked about that a lot, but that's kind of what I'm up to these days.
Well, TJ, people who are hearing that maybe don't know that, but the Catholic schools are probably one of the networks, one of the biggest educational networks in the world. Maybe only China and a few countries have more schools run by a single organization than Catholic schools. But what is the situation today? Just to go with a straightforward question of Catholic schools in the world, what are your vibes? I know it's a really general question.
Yeah, it's different in different places, but I can kind of speak to it a little bit. So yeah, there's 62 million kids served by Catholic schools around the world. That number's doubled in the last 50 years. So there's been, most of the growth has been coming from Africa, though it's also been growing in Asia. And yeah, there's like 217,000 schools. So it's an enormous contribution to the common good and to serving, human development around the world. Also historically, I think, this is something I've found in my work, especially in Africa and Latin America, that the Catholic Church, along with other missionaries, founded education systems around the world and really had an enormous impact. Today, it's a little complicated in a lot of different places for different reasons. A lot of that is related to some of the public policy context, and probably the other major thing is related to kind of secularizing trends and how that's kind of affecting school systems. So let's see how to talk about this. Maybe I'll just tell you a little bit about the US context and a little bit about Africa and Latin America, which are the places that I know best. So in the US, where historically Catholic schools have not received public funding, they fought for it in the kind of early 1800s when there was waves of Catholic immigrants coming to the US and didn't get it, largely because of kind of anti-Catholic discrimination at the time, which was quite prevalent. But in the last, the Catholic school system grew anyways with the growing Catholic population, which is now the largest religious denomination in the United States. At the height of the Catholic school system in the US, which was all privately funded throughout this time, in the 1960s, there was about over 5 million kids in Catholic schools and about 7,000 Catholic schools in the country. That was the peak. And then since then, it's been declining. Now there's less than 2,000 Catholic schools and less than 2 million kids served by Catholic schools in the United States. And that number, it's ticked up a little bit at a couple different times, but in general has been
Though
slow.
there has been a sort of a positive increase in the last years, no? From what I hear.
Yeah, there's been a COVID bump, which has been really interesting. Most Catholic schools in the United States stayed open during COVID or found a way to stay open, and often in contexts where other schools were closed down. And that seemed to have led to some enrollment gains that have stuck around. The other thing that's really changing fast in the United States, and now I may be getting ahead of myself, but is the changing legal context. So school choice, private school choice in the form of like vouchers and other publicly funded mechanisms have been enabling like enrollment stabilization in Catholic schools in a lot of states. They're not in every state. It's a state-by-state issue in the US, but that's been spreading pretty rapidly. So the story in the US, what's driven those changes, it's partially demographics, like the Catholic population founded schools in ethnic communities in cities. And then as they became upwardly mobile in the United States, they moved out to suburbs, and they didn't always build schools when they moved. And so there's growth in Catholic schools in the suburbs, but not fast enough to replace how fast they're closing in urban areas. And often the ones that were left in urban areas are now serving African American and Latino populations. So that's been a big thing. The cost has been a big factor. So the majority of the enrollment decline has been in low income and middle class populations. It's been stable among those who can pay for it. So really the financing thing's huge in the United States.
And then you were saying about the situation in Africa and Latin America, like what?
Yeah, it's so in Africa, basically what happened is that in the 1960s, when there's massive, especially in some countries, massive involvement of Catholic and Christian missionaries. They founded school systems all over the continent. And then in the 1960s, with the independence movements, many of them were nationalized or quasi-nationalized, which is kind of interesting. So very different from the US, where Catholic schools are super autonomous from the state. They have a lot of rights protected to be really independent and to have like religious freedoms totally independent from state control with some minor kind of limitations. In Africa, they're really kind of public-private hybrids. So after the states took them over, they took a ton of control over as well. So they took over their finances. They took over who's assigned as teachers. They took over who's posted as principals, sometimes with some degree of consultation with the sponsor, which would be like this church sponsor. So as a result, you have two kinds of Catholic schools throughout Africa. You have private Catholic schools, which have been growing steadily, but they're not funded by the state. And then you have these state-funded religious schools that have significant constraints on their autonomy, and so their identity is a little different. They're not.
Which basically, for what you are saying, is like when the state were thinking about developing an educational system, they saw what there were out there, and they decide, instead of creating something from scratch, let's fund that, but at the same time we are going to put regulation around that.
Yeah, and they seem to do it in such a way that they wanted more control, and there was also like a little bit of kind of an assertion of African independence that was happening there, and a little bit against international influence. But they also knew, it seems, that they couldn't do it on their own. So the missionary actors still stayed involved, and they have a lot of legitimacy. They were valued. But over time, as the states have gotten stronger, they've exerted more and more control. And so this is a debate now in a lot of African countries. Sometimes there's talk of handing them over more control back to religious organizations to have more autonomy.
The debate is within society, or within the schools, or
within society.
Okay.
So yeah, but I haven't seen places that have yet made the shift to kind of give more control back, but there's discussion.
What about in Latin America? Is it like Africa more or less, or you see also like their particular trends there?
It's a mix of two paths. So after, again, this happened after independence movements, which were mostly in the early 1800s in Latin America. And you had the debates in Latin America were whether to be more like the United States, with kind of a stronger separation of church and state, which was influenced by kind of liberal thinkers at the time, or to stay close to the Catholic Church. And these debates were like fierce in every country. It dominated the early politics in the region. And then countries kind of landed in different buckets. So you have places like Chile and Argentina and Belize, which stayed closer to the church and have much bigger footprint for faith-based actors and faith-based schools. They have more public funding of faith-based schools. And then you have other places like Mexico and Guatemala and Honduras and others that took a stronger liberal turn and nationalized the schools. And in Mexico and Guatemala, they like oppressed the church and kicked them out. And so you see a much smaller footprint of Catholic schools there. And it's kind of shaped their public policies as well. Some have not funded the Catholic school system, and others have, but it really seemed to have stemmed from the kind of early debates after independence movements. And one final little interesting thing now, that the Catholic school enrollment numbers have been on the decline in the region, even while private school enrollment has been growing. Part of this is driven by major demographic changes to have a lot more evangelical religious participation, and they've also been growing schools really fast in the region. That's probably the other major change.
Oh, that's interesting. Do you think, well, I mean, since there is Catholic schools, especially in non-Catholic countries, there has always been tensions among what is the place of a faith-based schools, but especially this has been especially controversial for Catholic schools, maybe because Catholic schools, they were not as much as focused to only provide education for Catholics, but only for the whole community. So they were even going to countries where there were not even Catholics, like Morocco, no?
Yeah.
Do you think that because of this nature of Catholic schools of going everywhere, the treatment or their state of situation is a good thermometer of educational pluralism or trust towards independent initiative in the field of education?
Yeah, I really do. I think some of the better data that we have available is on Catholic schools. The Catholic school network is more or less coherent. There's universities there. And so it's not great. It's hard to get some of these numbers and some of the understanding of these comparative legal landscapes. But in general, it's a pretty good source of information, I think, and is indicative. In some countries, I think there's differential treatments. In a lot of Western countries, there's a pretty strong standard of neutrality now in terms of treating different religious organizations the same way, certainly in the US, I think in most of Europe. But in other countries, that's not necessarily how things go. So in Latin America, you have a lot of countries that have preference kind of for Catholic schools from like concordats with the Vatican. So they're not necessarily equal treatment of different religious school systems. But you have the opposite in other countries, often where Christians are a minority. So think of Bangladesh and India, and we were at a conference together where we were hearing about Pakistan, and some of the regulations facing Catholic schools are differentially constraining, right? So there's quite significant limits on even the teaching of religion in some places, like in Bangladesh and I think in Pakistan. So those those things, there might be exceptions, I suppose, but I'd say, I guess, as a general rule, the situations that Catholic schools are facing are often indicative of the role of religious actors in schools.
In this regard, TJ, and focusing a little bit more on the Western world, no? But maybe this is also in line with things that are happening in other parts of the world. What do you think are the new threats of educational pluralism? Because that's the thing we've been discussing lately. And what do you think are the new threats that faith-based schools or parents wanting to choose faith-based schools are facing today?
Yeah, so I guess I'll speak mostly from the experience of the US and from some recent work that I've been doing in Latin America. I just completed a study of faith-based education in Latin America, and these issues were kind of coming up a lot in both contexts. So I think, and you would know more and can maybe add to this, Ignasi, about some of the international level. I can speak to how it's kind of showing up at a local level. But some of the contested issues in society today that are kind of hot button political issues, sometimes people call these like culture war issues on moral questions, often that may be different between more traditional religious people that adhere to traditional religious morals and beliefs, and from people that have different systems of beliefs, are really becoming flashpoints and becoming kind of contested issues within schools. So in the US, issues around gender and sexuality in particular, also on race, but I think the race thing is coming from a different place. So I'll just mention the gender and sexuality issues. There's been like an explosion of new laws proposed across states, often affecting public schools, but it's also been like a major thing that has been discussed within like the Catholic school world. This same issue came up throughout Latin America, and I've been hearing it a lot. So issues of curriculum and what children are taught and whether or not they're taught, how they're exposed to some of these issues. It comes up a lot in like sex ed, sexual education. The old debate used to be about whether or not you could have sexual education be kind of an abstinence only sexual education. The new debate is a lot more about gender identity and like LGBTQ issues, and how these issues are presented to children and when they're presented to children, how young or old children can be, and how kind of schools and school systems should navigate those issues. It's really I find it really interesting. I think that some of the debate is about wanting to teach children contested moral values. So one group is concerned for children who might feel discriminated against and wants to kind of use exposure to limit discrimination. And the other group feels like this is introducing topics that are complicated and sensitive to kids just too early in their lives, and for whom parents might not be comfortable with those kind of discussions until the kids are older. Yeah,
there is the idea. I think there is this problem with democracies, no, with the idea of trusting citizens, and in the field of education, that is basically trusting citizens on bringing other future citizens. We see that there is an increasing polarization, no, and increasing tensions, and depending on who is governing is trying to make sure that their cosmovision is there, or that certain cosmovisions are not there, no. And also there is the question of neutrality, no, which is like, doesn't make much sense for me, talking about neutrality on education, as at the end, like a big part of education is giving moral notions, and some of these discussions are being portrayed like the only thing we want is to put this information out there, and then children should be the ones deciding if use it or not, as if they don't have any moral connotations, no. And it's interesting, that for a big period of time, we have discussed about that before, no, but for a big period of time, the discussions were about funding, still are important, but now funding is not about if the state have the resources or not. It's like we are just giving funding if people are aligned with certain curriculums, which brings us, I think, to a new question, no, which is you were talking a lot that you study the effect of education, the effect, sorry, of education in development. Do you think that educational pluralism and the trust towards parents is a good indicator of the quality of democracy of a country? Would you dare to make a link between these two things?
I would say it a slightly different way, and I know we've talked about this. I've been thinking a lot about school choice or educational pluralism and social cohesion.
Mm-hmm.
I, as you know, I think all of us kind of around the world, the issues of social cohesion have kind of erupted. You know, maybe this was because of COVID, maybe this is because of the internet and social media, but it seems pretty clear that there's been populist movements, there's been social tension, there's been kind of violence in different places, contested elections, things that I would have never thought possible in the United States have been happening, but they've been happening in a lot of places. And so it's been leading me to reflect upon this more. I guess I think I'll get to your question, but I'm gonna go back for 1 second. The way people have been dealing with this primarily in the United States is to fight over it at the state level.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like a winner takes all approach. So they're fighting over how to control the narrative within public schools primarily, which is the majority of the schools in the US. And I just don't see how that ends well, because it's going to marginalize a large segment of the population, no matter what. So even in states that are a little more conservative, or we call them like red states, you know, more conservative states, there's still a lot of people who will feel that their deep moral convictions are being kind of are not being respected or not being heard, or how they want to raise their kids. And then on the other side, the same thing is happening. So this winner take all approach to regulating some of these moral issues and how they're taught to the future generations of children seems to me to be really fraught. And I don't see how it's going to get easier or fixed with that approach to politics and law. On the other hand, I think allowing people to have these deeply held moral beliefs, allowing them to have autonomy, and allowing the discretion of parents to be the primary decision makers seems to me to be both right, to be kind of in accordance with what I believe, and kind of like my own Catholic faith is these are some ideas that parents are the primary educators of their kids, but also like this seems to be a pretty strong tradition within like human rights law and historical norms. So I think it's probably the right approach. I will say, and I could see it kind of releasing some tension that are part of social cohesion right now. But I have one final thing to add. I have one worry about it. Does that lead us to be more and more siloed, and more kind of tribal? And is that over the long term going to lead us to be less socially cohesive? I don't know.
The thing here, and I think that's part of people who are framing. I'm pointing here of some of the people framing the debate, like putting autonomy or putting educational pluralism in contradiction with cohesion, no? And I think like many parents, what they want, they want to, when we think about education, even though like when we think in terms of policy, it feels like we are only talking about employment, but for parents, an important part is the transmission of values. But at the same time, most of parents, and I would say like 90% of parents, they want to transfer values, and they don't want to, and they want their kids to belong to society. They don't want to be an outsiders. And the way this is framed many times is like we have to choose, no? Like it's either social cohesion and it's one guy choosing for all, or it's either each parent can choose, and we have to, and we will have different communities isolated from each other. But when we talk with parents, and when we talk even with the school principals, and when we talk with people leading the schools, they say like this is an independent school leaders, like they want, first they realize like they are educating citizens that eventually will participate in public life, not only as politicians but also as voters. So, and on the other hand, like say like we want to be part of the conversation. It's not like the autonomy for us, it's not as a way of we want to be isolated and we don't want no one to bother that. And I think some people, and this is benefit, this when the debate is framed in this way, basically many, I would say, citizens say, you know what, I rather live in part of a community, being part of a community that being isolated. But this is not the debate. You know, this is not the debate we are having. And sometimes we have to, that's the problem. I think like we forget many times the main actors in the educational field, which are the educators and the parents in the field. Like if we hear them, not organizations, oops, sorry, it's easier than what it seems. Sorry. Okay, TJ, I'm gonna finish with one last question, which is we complain a lot, so let's finish with some notes of good of hope. What do you think? Give me some good news of educational pluralism for the future. Give me some of good things that might happen on this field for the future in the world, with good experience that you are facing. I know you've been in some countries. I know you talk with a lot of policymakers, civil society leaders. Can you finish that with a note of hope more than a note of optimism?
Yeah, I think I am hopeful, and I think though it's kind of messy and there's a lot of diversity and complexity in these issues around the world, when I step back and see the trends, it seems to me that pluralism is becoming the way forward.
Mm-hmm.
I think there you see small changes towards more pluralism in many countries throughout the world, more openness to public-private partnerships, more kind of, you know, I think these debates, these ideas of like neutrality that are both neutrality between religions, but also neutrality between religion and non-religion are becoming kind of prevailing norms. It's certainly become the legal norm in the United States, which is opening up the doors to more public funding of faith-based schools in different kind of legal mechanisms. I'm also seeing that in Latin America a bit. I also just think when you look globally at the trends of educational development, the highest there's tends to be pluralization in the forms of education. So there's more private providers, there's more decentralization, there's less state centralized control and more localization. So whether or not you're doing it for kind of efficiency reasons or economic reasons or for improving the quality of the system, or because you're doing it for things like cultural freedoms and religious liberties and things like that to allow for more pluralism, I think it's just the way things are evolving. So the highest performing systems in the world, like Singapore and other countries, there was a report from the McKinsey and Company in 2010 that said decentralization, local control, more diversity, more choice. These are patterns of the most improving.
Interesting. Yeah, we identified that in the Freedom of Education Index when we did the last one in 2016. Now we are doing the new one, but everybody felt like the trends are going to be terrible. But then we realized like freedom of education improved in all regions and all over the world.
Oh, wow.
In terms of academic freedom, but also in terms of funding for independent schools. We'll see what is going to happen now with COVID and everything, but still, like, no, thinking of the US, like there are good trends, and thinking about other countries, there are good trends. So we are also expecting now to see what happens, what are the results of this year. But it's true that when you take a breath and you see the situation with a bit of pause, like you see, that somehow some policymakers are saying that trusting citizens on, or creating some space of trust in the education of their children makes sense.
Yeah, and I think people are demanding that. I think more and more in society, people are desiring a little more control over how their kids are raised and how their kids are educated. And so whether for all sorts of different reasons. So whether it's for personal belief systems or just, the growth of the homeschool movement in the United States, like it used to be mostly a religious thing, and now it's all over the board. And so I think there's a trend towards desiring more local influence.
Solutions, no?
Well, it's a good thing. It's just, it seems to be a good thing for systems as well.
TJ, thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise.
And once again, in the name of OIDEL, we consider yourself a friend, but also thank you for all the research you are producing on this field, which is also really helpful for us to understand the situation of education in the world.
Thank you. Thank you, my friend. Good to be with you.
Bye.